Okay, a change of tone now here on Live from Paris, a time for perspective. Now, you've no doubt heard of the Chateau de Versailles, but what about the Chateau de Malmaison? It is just a few kilometres west of the centre of Paris. Indeed, the French capital, home to many famous museums like the Louvre, the Musée d'Orsay, but there are hundreds of others on offer with everything from one-room wonders to whole homes that take the visitor back in time. And to tell us more about these hidden gems, we're joined by author Emma Jacobs. Now, Emma, you have a new book out, Littler Museums of Paris. Firstly, tell us, how did that come about?
It started as a hobby. When I was living here, I used to just go on the weekends, and I tried to get to one or two museums a week, and started thinking about doing a little project for myself, and eventually realized how much work it would be, and decided to formalize it into a book.
Indeed, there's so many museums to choose from, even on those main boulevards. I mean, did you happen to stumble across one of the smaller ones, like the Phono Museum that you describe in your book? Is that how you sparked the idea that there's actually maybe hidden gems?
Once you start looking, I think, the information is out there, but I don't know that it's necessarily in one place. And some of them are very, very far off the radar. And like the Museum of Counterfeiting, you're not going to stumble across it. It's in a hôtel particulier, but once you start looking and once you start reading about the history, they're really fascinating.
Indeed, and even in your book, you explain a bit the history of those hôtels particuliers, these very posh mansions here in Paris, that a lot of them are in fact used now as offices or museums. But give us an idea of, for example, that counterfeiting museum, or there's another one you describe about a couple who bring hundreds, thousands even of artifacts from Japan and China, but who have never actually been there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole era in the late 19th century where all these private collectors, they all want to make their collections public, often very specific collections, like Asian artifacts or their private art collections or Italian art collections. And that's a whole genre of museums.
It's funny because it seems to be just people, really, ordinary citizens that have this massive passion that have started a lot of the smaller ones. Or?
For sure, yeah, particularly in that era.
And are they the people running these museums? I mean, do you get to meet them and find out a bit more about their background?
So for certain recent museums, I did get to meet them. A lot of the founders are dead, but I also met with conservators and museum directors about, how they try to make these museums contemporary, even if they've got older collections, like the Musée de la Chasse et de la Nature, Hunting in Nature. They've added contemporary art to try to make it, give it a wider appeal than a museum full of taxidermy.
What's the most surprising museum you have found in Paris?
So I love the Phono Museum, and it may have to do with my own interest, but because they're a less traditional, less formal museum, they do things like play old wax cylinders and things that you're not going to find in a typical museum, and is a really unique and special experience to hear.
Indeed, and unique to Paris. I have to admit that I did have a good few discoveries as well of things I need to put on my to-do list to visit, even though I've been living here for many, many years. One was the Musée Nissim de Commando, a Parisian apartment that, has basically apparently been left as it was in the 18th century.
Yeah, it's not 18th century. It was a 19th century collector who became, 18th, he dies in the 19th century, becomes obsessed with this period and collects all this furniture and actually knocks down his family mansion to rebuild one in the style to match his furniture, and creates this incredibly complete period atmosphere.
Fascinating, and his family carrying it on, and we can still visit those amazing rooms here in the centre of Paris today. Absolutely incredible. Now, in your book, you use a lot of illustrations. I mean, we're looking at some of the images from these museums that they've provided on their websites, but you chose to illustrate the museums that you found. Tell me a bit more about that. I
think my hope is that it slows people down a little bit. It's a little bit of the genre of a carnet de voyage. And I think, some of these images these museums are very unknown, but there's certain places, like there's the staircase in the Parc Monceau, in the Musée Moreau, that's probably the most photographed staircase in Paris. And the goal is to get people to look at things a little differently, to give them an angle and pull out details that will help people to
see it with a new eyes.
Yeah, and think more slowly and
Yeah, and break up the pictures we're seeing into specific elements.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, you currently live in Montreal, and I'm just wondering, do you think Paris is unique in many ways with the number of museums it has to offer?
Yeah, and I think there are a bunch of cultural factors that contribute to that, and some of it's the collecting impulse, and some of it's this particular, again, historical period where people were creating a lot of museums, and the cultural support from France and the cultural budget in France. I think there are very few cities that have as many institutions as France does.
Okay, interesting. Fascinating things. The littler museums of Paris is available now if anybody wants to, including us locals living here, wants to find out a bit more about the French capital. Emma Jacobs, thanks so much for coming in and giving us your time.
Thank you for having me.
Quick reminder for you now at home if you've just joined us, the top stories this morning. US President Donald Trump defends his decision to pull US troops out of northern Syria. It's a move that has been met with criticism from even within his own Republican Party. The UN and the EU fear it could open the door to a revival of the Islamic State group in the region.